Canada is at the center of something NATO still hasn't fully admitted in public. Not because Ottawa suddenly became the loudest voice in the alliance, not because Canada started spending like the United States, and not because the Royal Canadian Navy magically transformed into the most powerful fleet on Earth overnight. What changed was the battlefield itself. And in a strange way, Canada had already started building for that change before most Western navies fully understood where things were heading. Right now, inside NATO planning circles, naval doctrine is being reworked in ways that haven't happened since the Cold War. Some assumptions that guided Western fleets for decades are no longer treated as reliable. Others are being quietly abandoned altogether. And sitting in the middle of that shift is a Canadian warship program most people outside the defense world barely pay attention to. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why survivability has suddenly become more important than raw firepower, why the North Atlantic matters again in a way it hasn't for decades, and why some NATO planners are now looking at Canada less like a secondary naval player and more like the country sitting directly on top of one of the alliance's most important future problem sets. Because this story isn't really about ships, it's about what modern naval warfare is becoming. And honestly, a lot of Western navies are still trying to catch up to that reality. For a long time, the logic behind NATO naval power was straightforward. Big fleets projected strength. Carrier groups created pressure before a conflict even started. Advanced radar systems gave commanders time and awareness. The larger and more visible the force was, the more intimidating it became. And for decades, that worked. The sea itself helped reinforce the system. Water creates distance. Distance creates uncertainty. Tracking a ship across massive stretches of open sea used to be incredibly difficult unless you had enormous resources dedicated to doing it. The sea swallowed information. That's the part that changed. Modern surveillance architecture is compressing the ocean in ways naval planners spent years worrying about, but are only now fully confronting. Satellite constellations refresh imagery fast enough to track surface movements with alarming consistency. Long-range anti-ship missiles have spread far beyond the handful of countries that originally developed them. Passive acoustic systems can now catalog ships based on tiny differences in propulsion noise, cavitation patterns, and engine signatures. A warship doesn't just risk being detected anymore, it risks being persistently tracked. That distinction matters, because once tracking becomes reliable, survivability starts replacing intimidation as the real problem navies need to solve. And then the Moskva sank. April 2022, Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship, a vessel that had symbolized regional naval power for decades, was hit by 2 Ukrainian Neptune missiles and went down not long afterward. People focused on the political embarrassment, the operational failures, the damage control issues. But military planners looked at something else entirely. They saw a large, expensive surface combatant get located, targeted, and destroyed using systems that cost a fraction of the ship itself. That changes how navies think, because if a billion-dollar platform can be threatened by comparatively inexpensive combinations of sensors, drones, targeting networks, and long-range missiles, then suddenly the old logic starts looking dangerous. The ocean stops feeling like protection. It starts feeling exposed. And once you reach that point, the ships that make sense begin to look very different from the ships NATO spent decades building. That's where Canada enters the picture. At first glance, the Canadian Surface Combatant program doesn't look revolutionary. Outside defense circles, most Canadians probably couldn't explain what it is beyond new Navy ships. The program itself is based around the Type 26 frigate design originally developed in the United Kingdom. When it first started drawing attention, analysts mostly described it as practical modernization, capable ship, updated systems, long-term replacement for the aging Halifax-class fleet. Nothing about the public discussion suggested the program would eventually become strategically important to NATO doctrine. But underneath the surface, the design philosophy was already moving in a very different direction than a lot of older naval thinking. The Type 26 wasn't built around the assumption that dominating the battlefield would keep it safe.
It was built around the assumption that the battlefield already knows where you are. That changes everything. The acoustic management system is one of the clearest examples. These ships are engineered from the beginning to reduce underwater noise signatures as much as possible. Machinery is isolated carefully. Propulsion systems are designed to minimize detectable acoustic output. Even small vibrations matter, because modern sonar operators are listening for patterns, not explosions. In anti-submarine warfare, being quieter by even a small margin can completely change the engagement picture. And unlike older Cold War-era approaches that prioritized visible strength and overwhelming projection, this philosophy is much more restrained. Less emphasis on appearing dominant, more emphasis on remaining operational when conditions become hostile. The ship almost feels designed for a world where being detected is assumed from the start. That didn't seem especially dramatic years ago. Now it looks extremely relevant, especially in the North Atlantic, because what NATO planners are increasingly worried about isn't happening above the waterline anyway. It's happening underneath it.
Russian submarine activity across the North Atlantic has been increasing steadily for years, not in the kind of dramatic way that creates headlines every week, but in the quieter pattern military analysts pay close attention to. Patrol frequency, route complexity, deployment behavior, acoustic discipline. And the submarines involved are not outdated Soviet relics limping through extended service life. The Yasen-class boats, in particular, are among the quietest and most sophisticated submarines Russia has ever produced. NATO navies take them very seriously for a reason. Now add another layer to that picture. Underneath those same waters sits infrastructure most people never think about until something goes wrong. Fiber optic cables. Thousands upon thousands of kilometers of them crossing the ocean floor, carrying financial traffic, military communications, intelligence data, commercial systems, cloud infrastructure, and the digital backbone of entire economies. People imagine the internet as satellites and wireless systems floating invisibly through the sky. Most of it is cables, physical cables, and they are vulnerable. That vulnerability has started getting more attention in recent years because modern conflict is shifting toward disruption long before open warfare begins. A sophisticated adversary doesn't necessarily need to launch missiles immediately to create strategic pressure. Interfere with communications, disrupt financial systems, create uncertainty, slow coordination. The effects cascade fast, and suddenly anti-submarine warfare stops sounding like an old Cold War obsession and starts looking modern again. That's part of why NATO attention has quietly moved back toward the North Atlantic, and Canada sits directly inside that geography. The GUIK gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, has been strategically important for decades because Russian submarines moving from northern bases toward the Atlantic generally have to transit through that broader region. But people often visualize the GUIK gap like it ends at Greenland. It doesn't. The Labrador Sea, Davis Strait, Baffin Bay, Arctic approaches north of Canada. They all connect into the same strategic picture, and those routes matter more now than they did 20 years ago. Arctic ice conditions have been changing for decades. Areas that were historically difficult or seasonally inaccessible are becoming more navigable. That creates operational flexibility, more routes, more unpredictability, more space NATO has to monitor consistently. Canada's geography suddenly becomes difficult to ignore once you look at the map from that perspective. 3 coastlines, Atlantic access, Arctic access, North American approaches, northern maritime corridors. No other NATO member sits exactly where Canada sits, and unlike some alliance countries, Canada cannot relocate away from the problem set. Geography locks it into the equation whether policymakers like it or not. That's part of what makes the Surface Combatant program strategically important beyond Canadian domestic politics, because the current fleet is aging. The Halifax-class frigates entered service in the 1990s. They've been upgraded repeatedly, and Canadian crews have gotten remarkable operational value out of them. But there's a limit to how long older platforms can adapt to rapidly changing threat environments, especially underwater ones. Modern anti-submarine warfare is brutally technical.
Sonar environments are shaped by temperature layers, salinity, underwater terrain, ambient shipping noise, even North Atlantic storm conditions. Operators spend years learning how to separate meaningful signatures from background clutter. And submarines are evolving too. Quieter propulsion, better acoustic management, improved missile systems, longer endurance. This isn't static competition, it's constant adaptation. Which is why survivability has become such a dominant theme inside NATO planning discussions. The old doctrine emphasized concentration of power, carrier strike groups, massive visible formations, deterrence through overwhelming force projection. Now, planners are increasingly wrestling with a different question entirely. How do you survive in a battlefield where large formations are easier to track than ever before? That's where concepts like distributed fleets and lower signature operations start becoming more attractive. Smaller platforms operating collaboratively, shared targeting data, reduced emissions, acoustic discipline, networked capability without constant visibility. Not because navies suddenly stopped caring about firepower, because firepower becomes irrelevant if the platform carrying it cannot survive long enough to matter.
And this is where the Canadian Type 26 program quietly intersects with a much larger NATO conversation. The United Kingdom is building variants of it. Australia is building variants too. The design philosophy keeps resurfacing because the strategic environment keeps moving toward the same conclusion. Survival matters more now, especially underwater. That doesn't mean aircraft carriers disappear tomorrow or destroyers suddenly become obsolete. Naval doctrine almost never changes cleanly. Old systems remain important even while new realities emerge around them. But the direction of travel is obvious. The alliance is rethinking how naval warfare works in an era where detection systems are faster, missiles travel farther, and underwater infrastructure has become strategically critical. And Canada happens to sit in one of the exact regions where those pressures overlap. That's why this program matters beyond procurement headlines. It's not really about national pride, it's about timing. Canada committed to a survivability-focused anti-submarine warfare platform before survivability became the dominant NATO concern. Then, the strategic environment shifted hard in exactly that direction. Now, the rest of the alliance is paying closer attention. And honestly, there's something else here Canadians should probably understand. Canada isn't building dozens and dozens of these ships. Every hull matters. Losing operational readiness in the North Atlantic or Arctic isn't theoretical for Canada. Those waters are tied directly to continental defense, NATO logistics, Arctic monitoring, and transatlantic stability. If the alliance loses awareness there, the consequences spread well beyond Canadian territory. Which means Canada's new naval warship program suddenly carries weight far outside domestic politics or procurement debates. Nobody inside NATO believes they have all of this solved yet. That's important to understand. A lot of the doctrine being written right now is based on prediction, simulation, intelligence estimates, and lessons pulled from modern conflicts that are still unfolding in real time. The next major naval conflict could expose weaknesses nobody fully anticipates yet. Military planners know that, but the direction of concern is becoming increasingly consistent. Underwater infrastructure, acoustic stealth, distributed survivability, North Atlantic monitoring, Arctic access routes, persistent tracking threats. Those themes keep appearing over and over again, and sitting in the middle of several of them is Canada. Not because Canada suddenly became a naval superpower, because geography, timing, and changing battlefield realities pushed the country into a position NATO can no longer afford to treat as secondary. For decades, naval power was mostly measured by how much force a fleet could project outward. Now, another metric is starting to matter just as much. How long can that fleet keep operating once it's been found? That's the question underneath this entire story. And whether people realize it or not, Canada's new warship program is one of the clearest signs NATO is already trying to answer it.
Military power is changing faster than most headlines can explain properly. On Military Warfare, we break down the doctrine, systems, and strategic shifts shaping what modern conflict actually looks like beneath the surface. If that's the side of military analysis you're here for, you're in the right place.